We're delighted this evening to be welcoming David Kohn from David Kohn Architects for our lecture called The Performing City. My name's Mike Dring. I'm the Deputy Course Leader for the MArch, and we're bringing you this lecture as part of our MArch Symposium today, and also as part of the Urban Cultures Research Group here at the Birmingham School of Architecture. Before I introduce David, I'm just going to pass over to Alessandro Colombano, the course leader for the MArch, who's just going to say a few words about the course.
Hello, evening everyone, and welcome David Kohn for the lecture presentation. Just a brief kind of introduction to the day. Today we've kicked off semester 2 for our MArch architecture program. As Michael said, I'm the course director for the program. So we've had a kind of full day of presentations from students to kind of see the kind of range of work that we are undertaking at the moment and research. And there's been a broad kind of theme and scales and locations. Normally for these symposiums we often have a keynote speaker, so really delighted to have this talk today, one on a key project which we are seeing quite literally from our studio kind of windows, and one that will kind of gather a lot of interest as we see it develop. So I really appreciate David talking today, and I'll pass back to Mike, who will be able to kind of introduce the lecture properly.
Thanks, Alessandro. So yeah, just to offer a little bit of an introduction really as to the background behind inviting David to speak to us. I first met David probably 2019 with Bushra and Mohammed, now of Studio Nyali, at their review of their units at Eastside Projects. Some of you may know Eastside Projects, self-defined as an artist-run multiverse, and it's with whom they're collaborating at Smithfield. And the students from the Architectural Association were exploring cultural participation through food, processes of destruction, and approaches to heritage, which is all very pertinent to the work that the studio are doing right now at Smithfield. The journalist Rowan Moore described David Kohn's work as scrupulous, serious, respectful of history, and work that's grounded in the lived experience of buildings and the facts of construction, with what he described as a deadpan surrealism. The office is now celebrating 15 years, and their work spans scales from the apartment interior to large regeneration projects, most recently published in the Red House and in the buildings at the Greenwich Design District. Their new college quad has started on site, an extreme kind of architecture in the tradition of the Oxford type. So I think we're going to hear a little bit about their approach to some of these projects this evening. And it looks like the practice is very busy with another round of recruitment currently going on, just to get the plug in there for the recruitment. This evening we're going to hear from David about their work in Birmingham. They were appointed through international competition in 2020. And they're working in collaboration, as I said, with Eastside Projects for Birmingham City Council and the developer Lendlease to rehouse the city's historic ballroom markets, which is a huge project, a £65 million project that will transform the cultural centre of the city. And it's something that's very pertinent to, in particular, my own design unit on the MArch. We're looking at a site in very close proximity in an area called Highgate, which for a long time has been really, as part of the background of the city, is now very much going to be in the forefront of development as that kind of expansion, that kind of begins to inflect on development elsewhere. So really happy to have you with us, David. I'm going to transfer over to you now, and welcome to Birmingham.
Great, thanks Mike, Alessandro. Delighted to be here. I've got a 45 minutes slide presentation and the work of the practice as a way to introduce this fantastic project we're working on in Birmingham with the city and Lendlease, collaborating with Eastside to build the new market halls. I've titled the lecture "The Performing City." This is a performance is a vehicle for looking at architecture, in this case, through kind of a multiple series of lenses, whether it's the performance of people within a market, both the traders and the visitors, to the surrounding city. To what degree do buildings perform? Do they have characters? To building performance, particularly in this day and age with the climate crisis, how well do our buildings perform in terms of carbon reduction? So I'm going to look at performance, the performing city, through playing, making and working in 5 acts. So that's 4 historic projects, and the 5th will be about Birmingham Smithfield. A bit of expectation management. We are in the middle of a design process, engaging with the planners, market traders, other stakeholders. I'm going to show you some of the competition work and early research, and you'll have to watch this space in the future for how the design develops. So just to recap, 45 minutes, the performing city, looking at playing, making and working in 5 acts. So that's 4 historic projects and the Birmingham Smithfield market. As Mike was saying, so we're 15 years old, and this was the whole team a couple of months ago visiting our most recently completed project, the Red House. And if you're interested in this, Rowan Moore, who Mike quoted earlier, wrote a piece a couple of weekends ago in the Observer about this house. But I show this because I'm here presenting, but really, like all practice, this is a group endeavour, and it's the Birmingham project is the largest project in the office and that we've ever done. So a large part of the team you're seeing are involved in it. And of course, we're very fortunate to be working with Gavin, Ruth, Celine and team at Eastside Projects, an amazing artist collective based in Digbeth, and we met them through Celine as an artist that I've known for a very long time, and introduced us to Gavin and the wider group. And it's been an extraordinary journey. They're absolutely wonderful collaborators, and I think the work that we're doing in Birmingham is very much a product of our shared endeavour. And this is an image that Eastside had used before and has become emblematic of the way that we want to work. So this is the artist and the engineer standing on the shield of Birmingham, and they are the supporters of the city. And I think this goes to show quite the origins of the city as a place of making, of industry, and the idea that that's at the core of the identity of the place. But before I talk more about Birmingham, as I said, I'm going to show you projects that go back right to the beginnings of our practice, and hopefully will show you how ideas have evolved from the smallest scale now to working at the scale of a whole city block and contributing to a much larger master plan. So we're 15 years old, so started in 2007, and the Sky Room was one of our earliest completed projects. So this was a rooftop that was unused, unloved, and we were invited through a competition to propose bringing it into use. And we this was going to be a venue for the Architecture Foundation, which you probably all know, based in London. And it was going to be an opportunity to somehow enjoy everything that this roof had to offer that had hitherto been ignored. So this is the moment you arrive, and then there would be this room in which there could be all manner of events. You can see the city peering in over the parapet, and there would be little rooms surrounding it, and each of those rooms would capture a view. So a whole variety of scales of space with degrees of intimacy. And we worked closely with a contractor that we were working with on several projects at the time, and amazingly built a steel structure on a very tight floor plan that captured this idea of a central courtyard space and then rooms that leaned out to the city. And this was it completed. So it's by London Bridge Station on Tooley Street, and it was built as a temporary venue. It had an ETFE roof, and this kind of variety of rooms, one of which, perhaps more dramatically than others, projected over Tooley Street. And this became a venue for several years. And these are the original competition drawings explaining that it could be used in all sorts of different ways for as a venue for, say, speech, theatre, performance, as a cafe. And this was it on completion. So you can see the structure. It had a double layer of copper mesh that gave this wonderful moire effect, and the views were to capture the things on the horizon that were most prominent in that part of London. And then there was a back of house with all a space for a bar, loos, what have you. And this was the opening. And I think it was quite sweet the way you could see the buildings poking over the top, as we were saying, the Shard. You can tell it's 2010 because they're only as far as the concrete core. And it went on to be used for parties, lectures. We designed an inflatable roof that could fill the courtyard, and then later theatre seating, bleacher seating came. It had a life as a fully functioning bar restaurant for a while, and yeah, it was a wonderful project, and I suppose touches on these ideas of making space for performance, often space that has so many qualities, but until the point of the project, those qualities are not available to anyone. And I think certainly the site in Birmingham is so rich with possibility, and what we want to be doing is harnessing what's already there. I think what's interesting to see, the steel structure didn't go to waste. I looked online today, and this is a photograph of it converted into an office building. So the developer that sponsored the Architecture Foundation's venue did see long-term benefits eventually. And at the time, I wrote an essay about this kind of working, which I called Jiu-Jitsu Urbanism, which, if you're interested, it's online, but it talks about strategies that harness the existing potential of a place and redeploy it to greater effect. So moving on, this is another rooftop project, but was our first real taste of collaboration. And this is where there's some sound with this, and unfortunately you're not going to hear it, but we were very, very fortunate to meet and work with Fiona Banner, the artist who created this incredible work in the Duveen Galleries called Harrier Jaguar. She often deals with questions of power, the military, of colonialism, and this project took two defunct fighter jets that had seen active service in the Middle East and hung them within the Duveen. And our role as a practice was to help Fiona by doing the drawings to understand how could she fit these planes, which extraordinarily just fitted. And I think what was also extraordinary as architects and bringing our drafting to the project was to realize quite how extremely the form of the plane and the Duveen Galleries resonated. So you can see in the drawing, it's almost as though the profile of the building, this neoclassical architecture has an intimate relationship to this death machine, which I think was very much some of the subjects and questions that Fiona is interested in raising. And there was a book on site which had a log of the plane's service. So it was both kind of exquisite and a beautiful installation, and deeply troubling as well. Anyway, having worked with Fiona, there was a competition for to create something for the Cultural Olympiad in 2012, and I was delighted. She said she'd happily collaborate, and this was the outcome: a room for London, a one-room venue for living architecture, and curated by Archangel. And this is the film where Fiona is telling you how this is a vessel or a receptacle or a platform for a stage for other people's experiences, other people's creativity, the kind of space we hope this is going to be. So anyway, that was all in Fiona's dulcet tones. And there's some lovely music playing, and this is some of you may have seen this before, but it's a video that describes the whole making of the project. Which was in a shed in Brighton by Millimeter, who are extraordinary.
So, I mean, this is a real labour of love, and a lot of the form and the materials came through a reading of Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness, which was a story within a story set on the banks of the River Thames, of Marlowe describing a journey to the Congo. And there are lots of descriptions of a boat in the book, and this boat takes some references from that. So a riveted hull is described for one of the boats in the novel. I'm hearing the sound very loud in my ears while this is going on. Let's look at, oh, that's a bit better. And the idea of using this reference was that it might be possible in this space to talk about issues such as Britain's colonial history more directly during the Cultural Olympiad, and that this might broaden discussions about the place of London in the world at that time. And I think Archangel then took on that mantle and commissioned a series of writers in residence, musicians and artists, all of whom produced work in this venue, and I suppose to differing degrees explicitly engaged with the invitation to talk about a global Britain, but one that's very aware of its past. So the site was on the roof of the Queen Elizabeth Hall, which I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's top left there. And we were interested in its future as maybe a much more compromised place, suffering from the climate crisis. And the boat on the roof, tragically, the image coincided with the tsunami in Japan, in which the news was full of boats on roofs. So it didn't seem so far-fetched to contemplate that this vessel, this vehicle, might be an opportunity to talk about the future of London too. This is the original Roi de Belge, a paddle steamer that Joseph Conrad piloted up the Congo several years before writing Heart of Darkness. And this is our little boat, and there are lots of references to Conrad, his story, opportunities for future visitors to connect to different aspects of this vessel. It had a living quarters below and a pilot room above. It could be reconfigured for 1 or 2 people, so the beds slid and along with the doors. There's a trap door in the ceiling to take you up to the writer's retreat, and I think really significantly there was an auditorium below, so any event that took place upstairs could be enjoyed by a large audience, and also it was all broadcast live online. And so things like Brian Cox, who you might now know better through Succession, was asked by Fiona Banner to put on a performance of Heart of Darkness in the boat. The estate of it was a script for Orson Welles' first film, and Orson Welles' estate only allowed Fiona to put on the play if it was never shown again. So you had to be there. We also created a logbook, which was on board. So every evening, a member of the public could book a night in between these writers in residence, and were given the opportunity to chart their own journey. And this has become a wonderful record. I mean, the boat was there intended to be there for 1 year, ended up staying for 3 by having its planning permission extended, and there's 3 years worth of visitors' musings on what they were thinking, what was their course that day. And there's online a program of music events, writers in residence, and again, there's a beautiful piece of music in a video. I will hear it. I won't spend too much time playing you it, because so do go online afterwards. It's Andrew Bird, and I think it shows you how the bow that projected over the edge of the Queen Elizabeth Hall placed the performer somehow in the water. And I think it was also interesting the way they made this film, that you could see boats going by in the distance at different times, and passengers and what have you. But do go online, it's fantastic. So now coming to something more recent, and this is now moving up a scale. A couple of buildings that we're just completing. It says 21, it's actually 22. There's 2 buildings and one's due to finish next month. This is a campus of 16 buildings in Greenwich for developer Night Dragon, called the Greenwich Design District, and it's right by the Millennium Dome, as it was, the O2 Arena, and 16 buildings by 8 different architects. Somewhat controversially, we were brought together to work on a single master plan, but the architects didn't really collaborate on the building adjacencies, which I know to some seems odd, but I've drunk the Kool-Aid. I think it's worked out fantastically, and I think it's got a very good master plan by HNNA that creates very good scale of spaces between the buildings, and also a set of guidelines that meant that the relationships between them were successful. We made 2 buildings, which you can see here on the left, and one was certainly announced, the building, whether or not it was an entrance we'll come on to, with a second, and the 2 of them made that flank to the district and something of a street frontage. There's a couple of models that we made for the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, and perhaps they quite clearly show how the buildings were composed with a base course that varied between them. One very open on the left, the other more closed. The building on the right, you enter from the back. There then is this central portion which has this gridded facade, so that lines through, so that's, to our minds, mostly contributing to the sense of a street. And then they both had distinct tops, so there's this tripartite classical division. On the top of the left-hand building is this big sign, and on the right in the corner is a balcony. The little blue figures, we proposed to the client that they should also incorporate figurative sculpture, as this is very little chanced these days, and they have just put some in, which I'll show you in a minute. So the hope was that these would be creative buildings for creative occupants. They're designed to be low cost rent studio space, and they're currently letting at £5 per square foot, which, if you know your rates for property, that is very low, but it does go up. So this was this initial proposal to the client that these buildings would take all the different ways in which architecture has historically communicated, from a kind of classical ordering to figurative sculpture to direct signage, and again it was kind of quite rich, quite open to quotation, whether it be Sterling's treatment of the mills in Liverpool to make Tate, which has this massiveness to it that I've always really appreciated, or having a gridded facade, and I often returned to the Maison de Verre because, and I hope this image really captures this, it's really difficult to judge its scale. If you know this building, it's a doctor's home and surgery in Paris from the 1930s with glass brick, but it's always looked much, much bigger until you realise that it's only 2 stories of a Paris apartment block, which you can tell by the size of the windows above. And I love this ambiguity of scale. And in the context of the design district being amongst these very tall towers that are part of the wider peninsula development, this game of scales was very appealing. And then lastly, the idea of 16 buildings built for creative use strongly reminded me of guild houses and guild districts as parts of cities, whether it's Venice or in Flanders or the Low Countries, where buildings would be made for groups of people that shared a skill. These are kind of proto-professions, you know, architects arguably have their origins in guilds, but the buildings would be adorned with like the patron saint figure, or exhibit the skills of the occupants. And I felt that there was a connection between this on the one hand and Venturi's Scott Brown, Eisenhower's learning from Las Vegas as a kind of contemporary update. And I think as architects, if you know their work, they were postmodernists, although they didn't like the term at the time, who were very keen to assimilate historic architecture into contemporary practice. And so this is the result. So this is a photograph from recently, and there's something very sweet. So there's a photograph of Max Creasy with a little bird. There's birds appearing in all of the photographs. You can see one sitting on the top there. So you can see the kind of giant columnar order, the grid, where, you know, maybe the scale of the building compared to the legs is a bit ambiguous. The sculptures, which I can now tell you the client loves Damien Hirst, and took the opportunity to add a couple. There are other Damien Hirsts throughout the peninsula, and then the rooftop sign announcing the district, because from the behind us here is a bus depot, so everyone arriving sees this building first. So here are all the different elements, and they provide affordable workspace. And this is a good example. So this is a studio where they're making soaps, and I think it's just been fantastic seeing it occupied, and the scale. These are the windows to the north, and the sense of the scale of the tall ceilings and the daylight suddenly making for a really functional space. This is the rear facade where that window image was taken, and this is the second building. So this has on its roof a balcony which looks towards a park, and I thought there's another image, but on the rear of this building are several pockets designed for new sculptures that will be made on site by people within design district, so that there's almost like a living wall of changing of sculpture that will expand the idea of collaboration to those based in the design district. So this is the last current project before we get on to Birmingham. I think we've got 20 minutes to keep on time. This is a project for New College, Oxford, which was founded in the 14th century, and one of its claims to fame was it invented the quad. This is the first, well, it invented the first ever planned and designed in a single phase quad. Prior to this, there were lots of buildings in the city that were given over to educating young men that had travelled for that, but they were separate buildings that had begun to agglomerate into something new. But this was the first time that there was a project to create an entirely new type of building, where, as you see in this image, there is a chapel, there's a master's lodge, there are all the student rooms, and a dining hall, a library as one building. And that became the type for colleges to expand. And what this image shows, which I think is really helpful clue to understanding the type, is it's a bit like Chinese courtyard houses. The biggest college is not necessarily one with the largest court, it's the one with the most. So they expand by adding quad after quad after quad. And so at the bottom of this picture you can see New College, and the largest quad is Great Quad that I showed a picture of before. The quad to its left is Cloister Quad, and that is where Harry Potter is filmed, so it really is that kind of Hogwartsy type of environment. And we were very interested in the kind of glacial but nonetheless significant change to the building type over time, and how that mirrored changes to the relationship of the college to the outside world. So in 1403 it was very introverted. It was a cloister-like space in which a community could turn itself away from the city, be protected. There was a lot of trouble, violence between town and gown at that time. But by 1685, wealthy townsfolk were beginning to be invited into colleges to have an education. There was the first three-sided quad, where it opens out with views of the city walls. And when we entered the competition in 2015, we proposed that there would be a continuing opening up of the institution to the world, to nature, and that there would start to be a formal equivalence between landscape and building. And this is the building that arrived. So ours is this horseshoe in the center, and what it is doing is completing quads created by other buildings. So there's 3 south-facing quads. To the left, to the west, there's a quad for New College School, which was founded at the same time as New College in the 14th century. A central quad and an east quad, and then with a similar formal language in the bottom, so southeast corner, is a new tower, an accommodation building, and then a porter's lodge. And I think, I mean, the relevance of this to Birmingham, I think, is the kind of complexity of the site and the relationship to heritage, which I'll go on to explain. But here you can see the complex figure, but if you go back to the site plan, you can realise that the form is governed entirely by circumstance. So whilst it feels like something very willful and idiosyncratic, it is in every way adjusting to its context. The offset distances required to adjacent buildings, the roof lines that adjust to listed, the heights of listed buildings adjacent, the plan forms allowing the creation of these outer quads, and then the curved plan, which turns what is one of the smaller quads in Oxford into something that has a greater sense of interior than the form would naturally allow, by having this kind of swelling out to the north. And here you can see the variety of rooms that you get in the different views. So this is a recent image for the planners. So the Porter's Lodge, bottom right, the new tower with associated accommodation, and then the quad building, which is making these kind of outdoor rooms. So this is now a journey through the new campus, and I think what's been really interesting working in Birmingham in relation to this is the idea of taking a large plot, and this question of to what degree is it something singular, or is it an urbanism all of its own? So here it's like one place, but it has actually many parts and spaces between them, and it's the journey between all the parts that actually is the kind of structuring order. So you will see the tower to the Porter's Lodge, which frames views to, on the left in the distance is a listed building, on the right is the new accommodation. The new building on the left closes a court with an existing building on the right, and here you can see how the roofs drop to meet the apex of the roofs around them, and the form was very much driven by the fact that, if you say, you know, I think people commented it is the flowing form like Gaudi, and I think what's interesting about Gaudi's work is that a lot of it was contemporaneous with the buildings on this site, which goes to show how different architectures that from the same period in history can have very different currency in different periods. So the feeling was that the building on the left still feels contemporary, but maybe its origins are very similar to the building in time to the building on the right. And then you have a moment in the centre of the site where this court envelops you, and that form is then carried through into the rooms. And then this is turning back this tower by the gateway, which is perhaps the most elaborate formally. And again, this is a way of, would you believe it, getting the maximum amount of rooms on this site, given all of the view constraints, given the listed context. And here you can see how the building on the right, the new building, creates a courtyard for the school. Again, kind of 1906 building on the left. Performance. So we're on site. This is an incredible video that was produced by Sir Robert McAlpine when pitching for the job. So this is all done, kind of 4D BIM, and this is where we are today. So the basements have been dug. You can begin to see the form of the courtyard, and we've started to select the stone blocks. One of them we carved into a model of the building. This was at the Royal Academy in a different summer exhibition. And this is really interesting just to realise the labour involved in making each of the parts. So the tiles have a diamond geometry which accentuates the curve of the building. The stone, as you'll see, it's surprisingly thick. That's because it's load bearing. It carries its own weight. It has compression joints, so it's a proper masonry wall. And that decision was taken for longevity. And I think there's a bit of resurgence of interest in stone because from a carbon point of view, it has much less, it produces much less carbon to extract and build, and the carbon remains captured within it compared to, say, concrete. Although the frame for this building is concrete, but not the envelope. So it should last for several hundred years, which again I think is part of the strategy of trying to make it as environmentally friendly as possible. And here you can see the compression joints and the load-bearing stone, which is tied back at each floor plate, and the detail. So, I mean, this is a project that's got a couple of years to run, and Birmingham is one we're just starting, but I think there's no less ambition around how to make it, and I think making it, we hope, will be much more about perhaps local construction, sourcing of materials, and certainly Lendlease, the contractor, have committed to that. And this was the image that we made for the competition, and it was a competition in which you were expected to make one key image, and this was working with Eastside, and I think it's probably the conversation that led to this being a drawing unlike one that we have made before, but felt like it was trying to bring together as many different things into this one special place. And this is an image that's in the public domain of the master plan. So I think crucially at the bottom here is the church, St Martin's, and the wedge-shaped building in front of it is, this is, I mean, a historic view that precedes our involvement, but the market proposal, and as you can see, it's part of a much larger redevelopment of what was the wholesale market site. Again, a drawing from the public, it's in the public domain, the church at the top there, the market beneath it, and then a larger master plan spreading to the south with large public spaces incorporated. So to return to this subject of collaboration and the supporters of Birmingham, the artist and the engineer, this is images from our competition entry in which we described the project of arriving at an outcome would be very much a journey where we would gather friends, have conversations, and it would be something done collectively. And I think it's very much the kind of ethos that we want to pursue, and one that we've started doing with the Eastside projects. So starting from this idea of supporting the city, this was images from each of the contributing consultants. We have a wide team of structural engineers, service engineers, graphic designer, and each of them wanted to contribute some particular direction to the project, and that this would be then galvanized through making a building that brought together very varied spaces into something that we called a joyful convergence. And this was a drawing inspired by conversations with Price and Myers, and the idea that the structure might be something that is not just holding up the building, but providing also the servicing infrastructure, and it would perhaps be at a scale that could become spatial. That the roof would be an occupied space that would take advantage of the views of St Martin's, which is an important piece of heritage on the site. It might be somewhere where you could have education events, there's a cinema shown here. But then also associated with the market would be maker spaces, and Eastside have a great track record of establishing maker spaces in Birmingham, such as Steam House, and that there's a potential that things that are being made on site could then be sold in the market, and there would be this much closer relationship between production and consumption. The site, it's kind of extraordinary that there you can see St Martin's and the bull ring behind, and the foreground is what was the wholesale market. And I thought it reminded me of this image of Denise Scott Brown, just to tie it back to learning from Las Vegas, but then it's a city with a deep history that actually is directly beneath the site. So you can see St Martin's there in the centre, but then to the south is the moat that was around the original manor house that the Birmingham family occupied, that is the beginnings of the city. And you can see through, this is an 18th century map, shows the growth of the city, the gradual decline actually of the properties within the moat, and that this is I think the last image of it before it was all demolished in the 18th century. And this is an extraordinary view now from the north. This is the bull ring, looking at St Martin's, which somehow feels like this extraordinary connective object that survived extraordinary change. So here, St Martin's in the north, the wholesale market. This is the building that has built in the 19th century and demolished, and making a site for this current development. So here you can see St Martin's there in the centre, and the bull ring to the north, the open space that is now, as you'll all well know, the bull ring shopping centre, and to the south was one of the markets. And I think what's been interesting for us is to, so the building there to the south, the red brick building, was a market building that subsequently became a hotel. But what's interesting is how civic the architecture is in a kind of Edwardian way compared to what we now know of the area, which, to back to Denise Scott Brown, there's been a lot of very adventurous redevelopment over the last 70 years, in part due to bomb damage and changes in attitude to city making. But this is the building that was on the site that we're now looking at. So the new Corporation Market building, extraordinary confection. And this is what happened to St Martin's in the Second World War. And if you couple that with this was one of the other markets directly adjacent. So this was the Bullring markets from the 19th century, which Herbert Manzoni, in his project to reorganize the centre of the city for the motor car, demolished to make the inner ring road. And I think what's extraordinary that the church makes yet another appearance, and there's this extraordinary little sign on the right to the Bullring market. So you have this sense of a bit of city that really has been torn apart in different periods to remake it in a new image. This is a kind of interesting image because you can see how recently that Corporation Market building existed. I think this is from the 60s, and you can begin to see in the foreground as the early Bullring. And here again, the church top right makes an appearance, and you realise, you know, a completely different type of modernist urbanism, and of course, all the time, the continuity of trade and performance and life, and underneath it all is this, which is the original manor house, which we know roughly where some of it is. It was surveyed in the 1970s. It's beneath the site of the wholesale market, so that is something that we're looking at, understanding what role it might play in the future of the site. It's been really interesting looking at the history of even recent proposals. So this is the idea of a moat park, a park in the form of a moat from 2011, Joe Hollyoak. And to return to the kind of right up to date, the journey that we are on, so there's both the research into the history, which will inform the project in the way that others I showed you earlier did, but then working with Eastside, they brought the idea of a differing code of conduct. Of course, as architects, we all sign up to one, but this is one to do with working with the local stakeholders, the traders, and others. And Eastside have good form in working with the market. This was a project from several years ago, a competition to present fish to the public, of which this group won. And I think this idea that trade is a performance that can be heightened to sell better, engage your customers better, and that actually in a digital age where so much is available online, this is what markets are for. They're for meeting people who understand the produce, having a conversation about where it's from, and that for many people that social dimension is central. We've actually toured the country looking at markets, and one thing that is common is some people are there every day because that's the civic space that they want to occupy. And we've been, this is Eastside Projects, you see Gavin in the foreground there. These are our students, which Mike referred to. So for the last couple of years, even before we started the work with Lendlease and the city, we've been working with Eastside on projects. So this was our students performing parts of Birmingham. They're dressed as different bits of city archaeology, and we've also started to make the most of the markets. This extraordinary sushi restaurant, which I can absolutely recommend. It slightly reminds me of the story of the 3-star Michelin sushi restaurant in the Tokyo Underground. I mean, this gentleman has, I think, about 5 seats, and he makes it all in front of you, and it was some of the best sushi I've had. This is some of the wider design team, and the point we're at now is beginning to work on expanding the consultation and design. And I'm pleased to say that Eastside's consultation with the market is now part of the Birmingham Art Map, and this is to show you some of the work that's emerging from artists that will be involved. So everyone thinks of the work that Fiona Banner did in influencing A Room for London. It's very much the hope that an artist like Samara Scott will contribute to elements of the building, and it won't be art in the sense of something added. It'll be involving Samara and others in actually developing the fabric of the building as a collaboration. Another artist, Nicholas Singh, Sarah Taylor, so each would bring very different ways of working that might be tailored to different parts of the building. And Harold Offe, interested in children's play space, so how can we make the building be as open and welcoming to all comers. And then we've also worked with the market traders. So this is Mark El Khatib, who's a graphic designer, working on the project, spending a day with David and his father Martin at the rag market. And everyone in the team has gone down and worked with different stall holders, so we get a real sense of the actual day-to-day workings. And I think this has been a great experience for everyone involved. And Mark has gone on to start to look at the signage for the market, the kind of pleasure of the different languages that are there, and how this might lead to new signage. Also, the various paraphernalia that are indispensable in any market, a good clock, and just gathering the variety of signs that already exist. And this is an early sketch about to what degree might the signage take on this kind of gargantuan fruit, tell you where to go. Architecturally, one of the things that was very interesting was visiting Leeds, which is a building probably quite like the original building on the wholesale market site that was demolished. And inside it has this extraordinary hall with varied roofscapes, and then each of the stalls are a little building of their own. It was probably one of the most impressive markets that we visited. And this is a drawing, a survey drawing of the facade, and so I very much appreciated its fruity roofscape. Looking at markets elsewhere in Istanbul, just quite the energy of a street market, but also looking at Digbeth and understanding what is the ground beneath the site and how can we connect to the topography, the particular history of the canals and the industrial infrastructure that's throughout this part of the city. Can that connect to other ideas of market that are less about halls and more about interiors, so kind of souks? And this is again an undercroft space beneath the Padua market, and as an example, a piece of work done by a student at the Architectural Association last year. Each one of them looked at a different market and how that research is also now informing the design. And we're coming to the end, I think 10 minutes over. And this is an image of Lina Bobardi's Sesc Pompeia, an amazing space in Sao Paulo that perhaps captures this sense of it's a market, but it's also potentially so many other things as well. And here how the water might connect to other parts of the site with a rooftop garden, Hundertwasser. So that's the journey. Thank you very much. Hopefully I explained something of the process in the practice, how smaller earlier projects like the Sky Room and A Room for London taught us how to enjoy working with others, how to discover parts of cities that are dormant but so full of potential, and how to really make buildings perform for the city. Very happy to take any questions. Sorry about the technical issues earlier. As I say, do go online. The various films I showed you are there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. It's a real pleasure to watch you talk about your work. We've got a comment question in the chat here. So if I can just maybe ask you that one first, David. This is Sadesh said, what was the significance of adding words from different languages to the market competition image? It's lovely and inclusive. And if
So I
came from
suppose
a particular discussion.
I mean, if you go to Birmingham markets today, there are lots of signs in different languages which reflect the different communities that use the market and the different people that work there. So I think it is both the reality of the place, but also very much the future that we want for Smithfield, that it continues to be this very diverse, heterogeneous place in which lots of different communities feel welcome. I know that today not everyone feels that way about the markets, that they perhaps aren't as welcoming as they once were. It had a very long and varied history, but I think that's very much kind of core to the project. What is a public space in which everyone is welcome, and it offers a true breadth of possibilities? I think a quote that was oft used when we were teaching was, markets are a place for the every person and where almost anything can happen. That was Carolyn Steele from a book, The Hungry City, which is very much about markets and their roles in cities. So I hope that explains something of the relevance of the languages.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. We've got a comment from Bob Ghosh, founder of K4 Architects. So he said, not a question, but more of a comment. I love the way that you work so closely with Eastside projects and directly with market traders. This is a true collaboration. I can't wait to see how this materializes. Thanks, David, for your insights into the process and your other projects. I think it's going to be really exciting. I think further down the line, perhaps when you're able to share perhaps more of the ongoing process. I think it's really great to get the insight today into what the founding principles are of your engagement with the city. I think that's really comes through in all of the work that you presented about how much you care about how you respond to the conditions that you're working within, whether it's in a rooftop in London or if it's kind of dealing with the tradition of the Oxford quads. I think there's a real sense of understanding those conditions. Maybe if I can ask you a little bit of a question, and by all means, others, if you do want to post any questions, we've got a little bit more time if you want to ask those questions. Is the means by which your work is made, although the buildings that you presented are quite different, obviously, with the heavy stone facade of New College and the kind of the fritted glass, I think it was, in the facade of the Greenwich Design District. It seems to be a kind of an appropriate economy in operation in the project that I would imagine is difficult to hold on to as projects develop. Is that your experience, or do you have kind of great enough understanding from the outset of what you hold dear in a project, and do you think that's going to be a major concern in Birmingham in terms of trying to achieve the kind of qualities that you're seeking in the project, or is it more about the space and the openness in the markets project?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I think that questions of construction material are always critical to influencing the experience of places, and therefore one's understanding of the identity of places. And it's true that it's probably hard to make those things align, that the way something is made positively contributes to the place and resonates. And I think that's going to be no less a challenge in Birmingham. And I think we're just at the point of beginning to talk about these issues, and I think there needs to be a balance. Obviously, you want the highest quality, but at the same time, a market is a very provisional space that you want to really perform incredibly well economically. So I know that one of the biggest issues for market traders is the cost of a pitch, and the building can contribute to that. So the better the building achieves everything it needs to at a kind of economic price point, directly connects to the longevity of the market as a trading place. So it's trying to find that right balance. I think, given the world that we're in, addressing the climate crisis is very important. Ensuring that we're using materials that reduce embodied carbon, and also potentially the opportunity for buildings, materials that could enter a circular economy in the future and be used for other buildings. I think that's all really significant, and hopefully if we get that right, the markets will really resonate with Birmingham and that place. And I mean, the point of showing all of the history is, the hope is that will all be available to you as a visitor. It won't be some forgotten story in the archives. It'll be something that you can feel and see and connect with.
I think from the perspective of my own research, where I've been mapping the city over, well, really a couple of centuries, I guess, I think there's the kind of resistance to urban change and allowing things to be perhaps slightly inefficient and to become old and worn is not something that we're very used to in Birmingham. So particularly, as you mentioned, the post-war period with Manzoni's reconfiguring of the city through widespread infrastructural projects. I think that the idea of the transitory nature of the city is still very relevant and still very evident in the city. I suppose what I'm intrigued by is in what ways this project might begin to offer some kind of fixed ground for the city. But we can't tell what might happen in 100 years' time. But it would be nice to think a building with the embodied carbon we put into it might last longer than the current market building, which is, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years old. It's not particularly old building. I've got a comment from, sorry, I don't know if you wanted to respond on that at all.
No, just to agree the sad fact of the existing buildings being relatively young as building, particularly in the conversation today, where you'd want them to really continue to be reused. But the other thing to say is that markets, more than most buildings, move about. So if you look at, we've studied markets in London, for example, and they've often the market as an institution has lasted, hundreds, if not 1,000 years. Markets as buildings, obviously, have moved often, half a dozen times during that lifespan.
Yeah, I suppose the consistency of the trade activity on this particular site, though, is as you said, that exploration of the topography of the site is kind of really a relevant part of that story, I suppose. There's a question from Lyle. He said, fascinating talk, David. I wondered what role, if any, water might play in the proposed plan for Smithfield, especially given the River Ray is set to be revealed in another development close by. How important is it to have water in such a project?
So we're doing a piece of work for a client in Hong Kong at the moment, and I can tell you feng shui is something I'm thinking a lot about, and water is always critical. And yeah, I think definitely there's a lot of conversations around water on the site, whether that will be with features within public spaces that are connected by water courses, whether that will be visible within the building. I think very much it's part of the discussion, and I think everyone's keen that it's done in a way that feels authentically about the site and to avoid it feeling superficial. And I think that's probably the challenge. Is we feel it's a good thing to do, but I think we're at the point now of trying to work out exactly how will that connect to the history of the place, and probably not every feature that might involve water is right. So that's probably where we're at, is trying to get the right scale and level of water feature. But I think it will be in the project, yes.
I think there's a bit of a connected question from Mike Grace, who was asking about local food production and embedding connected natural spaces in the project. And obviously, you know, as you've just been saying, it's got to be a kind of something with integrity. So if you're going to bring water into the site, it needs to kind of respond to either the kind of topology or the natural course. And has there been any thought about local food production or that connection between people and the history of that site at all?
Sure. At the competition stage, we advocated that there would be growing on site, and that it may have an educational dimension in which, I mean, the particular story that we told was, is it possible that schools might visit the market in the future, and the opportunities to grow things would allow a kind of educational dimension to the project. I think what we're conscious of is that probably the realities of growing enough conventional produce to sell on site is that it's just probably not a big enough area, but that there are, I think at the competition we were like, there are particular crops that you can grow and sell on site, for example, herbs, so that we imagine it's more a site that might have gardens that are about sharing and instructing and educational purposes rather than food production per se, but that with that knowledge you might go back to your school or to your allotments, and it might influence what you grow there, and so then it's connected to a wider story about food, Birmingham, you know, changing eating habits, and you know, the broader impact that a market can have on a community.
Great, thank you. I think Alessandro, did you have a question you were going to ask?
Yeah, it's I guess it touches upon perhaps some of those last aspects of water and food, but I really enjoyed the kind of build up leading up to Birmingham, the Birmingham project, with different scales and typologies. I've got a few points really. One of it was whether in your research you'd come across the competition entry from Richard Rogers for the Millennium Project for the Library of Birmingham, which was going to be near Eastside. And
Right, no.
because it's what's interesting about it, and perhaps past projects in Birmingham, but also some of your conceptual drawings it seems like the Smithfield project has a kind of technosphere, or kind of, I don't want to quite say high tech feel about it. There's a playfulness to it, more than that. But I kind of see other references in, like, non-stop city, and so on. There's this idea of the future, and but a playful way with it. And some of your images have shown that kind of in the past, the city has been kind of ripped up and started again. Often the people who have been able to kind of have that hand to play with the city have been in a quite privileged position. So I guess part of the question would be, how do you see the kind of the future vision of the market? One that perhaps beyond that we can't anticipate at the moment. Some of it might be food and water, for example, like people have mentioned. But also, are you kind of looking at adapting strategies for change, and how much do you control that now, or how much are you kind of able to kind of encourage, facilitate later on, or do you just let it happen naturally?
I mean, there's lots of bits to the question. I'll talk about the kind of design thinking at the moment, and hopefully it'll kind of connect with what you asked. I mean, I think market buildings do, in their very nature, have a kind of flexibility needed of them. I mean, you could argue that some of the limitations of the buildings that currently house the markets, and the reason why they're going to be demolished, is that they're not very flexible. I mean, there are large parts of them that don't have daylight, for example, that are not naturally ventilated, that that are very expensive to run, and those costs are passed on to traders. And I think the hope is that the new buildings will create a genuinely flexible environment in which it can be reconfigured and used by different traders in the future without the need for significant investment. That the building is thought about as a place that can change. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean something very light or flimsy. I think it can also mean that parts, I mean, I think this touches on Mike's comment about the topography, creating a platform on which the market happens, and that possibly the history of the second half of the 20th century urban development in that area is more about adding layers in which what was the original ground is somehow lost. And I think that can also be part of a strategy for long-term flexibility, is that there's something that is very clearly established as the platform for these different uses. I think the buildings then should just try and do basic things very, very well. Good daylight, good ventilation, good servicing strategies, and I think in terms of us wanting other uses as well as traditional trading environments, such as performance, or we're working with Charcoal Blue, the theatre consultants, and that's all about achieving good acoustics, good sight lines? How do we create the kind of sectional relationships between potential audience and performer relationships that mean the building naturally hosts lots of different performance? These things, if we think about them now, should be there for future audiences to discover. They don't need to try and make a space for performance in it. The building naturally does that.
Fantastic. I think just referring to one of our guests, Bill Alves' question, which is about the inclusion of visually impaired members of the society. I think that idea of the building as a platform for anyone to access seems, even though it's at a relatively early stage, the work that you're presenting to us, it seems quite evident in the fact that you're trying to establish that the ways in which people will feel welcome in that building, whether it's through programming for cooking school or herb gardens, or reinstating the market traders with an affordable rent. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see that idea emerge further. I think we've more or less come to the end of the questions, and we're on 10 to 8 now. So I just want to say thank you, David, for your time this evening. It's really much appreciated. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us this evening, and to Xiaoling for producing our call. Hopefully we'll see you again in Birmingham again soon, David. You're always welcome
For sure.
at the School of Architecture. Perhaps if you can come and join us for some reviews at some point, that'd be fantastic. And yeah, really supportive of your work here in Birmingham. So thanks very much, and see you again soon.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.